Development. My name is Charlie Allegar. I'm a communications assistant here at CGD. Today I'll be co-hosting our event with my colleague Emily Fakey, who is a research assistant here. She's waving at you over there. And for those of you who may not know, the Center for Global Development is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank dedicated to rigorous research and policy innovation for the benefit of the poor around the world. And it's a real pleasure to see so many fellow young professionals and students of development turn out for this event, which will be both more interactive and more oriented toward early career professionals than any event that CGD has ever held before. So my hope, our hope, is that today we can kind of start to envision the future of our field, both how international development is changing and how it should change. And certainly, we will start to tackle those questions both in the panel discussion and in the interactive segments that will follow. And importantly, the conversation that we have today won't end today. CGD really wants to know what you think. And that includes our new president, Masoud Ahmed, who asked me to organize this event. And so we hope that you'll be back for future events at CGD, but also keep in mind that after today, we're going to report out on this event and present a kind of a summary, a highlight reel of all of your input from the various segments of today's program. So keep that in mind. There'll be plenty of opportunity for you to share your input about the future of international development, whether live over the microphone or on the survey sheets that you would have gotten at registration or on Twitter, where you can tweet at us during this event with our handle at CGDev with the hashtag CGDTalks. Hopefully we'll be able to have a virtual conversation while we have this dialogue in the room. This last logistical note, unfortunately, our elevators are being repaired tonight at 6. So if you need an elevator to get out of here or you just really hate stairs, your last chance will be around 5:55. All right, so first I would like to invite our Chief Operating Officer and former Director of Global Health Policy, Amanda Glassman, to come up here and offer just a few welcoming remarks.
Thank you. Thanks, Charlie. And thank all of you for coming. We really appreciate it on behalf of all of the old professionals. I do want to say, though, I worked at the Inter-American Development Bank, and they defined young professional as 36 years old. So excellent, right? I mean, you can be long. Maybe you're far from that, too. But I just want to also underline what Charlie said, that we really appreciate the time you're taking to come here and share your thoughts with us, that this will matter for us and our work going forward, and we hope for the whole field of development. I don't think we've done such a great job at figuring out the big problems so far. So hopefully you'll have better strategies in mind and suggestions for us to take forward from a truly globalist perspective. Because, right now we're in a political situation that is very far from that view of the world, almost antithetical to development. So welcome and enjoy. And also thank you very much to our own staff and colleagues and former colleagues that have taken the time to put this together. Thank you.
And welcome. Thank you for joining us here today. I'm Emily Fakey. I work here at the Center for Global Development. I'm really excited to share our panel with you today. Delighted to introduce you to them as they're getting seated. So directly on my left is Rebecca Smith, who is a migration policy analyst in the World Bank's social protection and labor practice. She specializes in building migration systems in sending and receiving countries. Currently, she's the lead consultant on a technical assistance program for the government of Afghanistan to design and build its nascent labor sending system. On her left is Ami Amin, who currently works at the Millennium Challenge Corporation as a policy officer on the selection and eligibility team. Prior to the MCC, Ami held positions at the State Department and the Office of Foreign Assistance, and at USAID working in PEPFAR monitoring and evaluation. Kate Wathan is a global communications professional with DevEx. She previously served as a press officer with USAID's Office of U.S. Foreign Disaster Assistance, oversaw media relations for the Center of Global Development, and managed consumer PR and crisis communications for Kaiser Permanente. On her left is Krishnan Raghavan, who is a second-year MA student in International Development and Conflict Management at Johns Hopkins SAIS. Krishnan previously spent 2 years in Nairobi, Kenya, managing humanitarian relief programs in Somalia with the International Rescue Committee. And finally, Janine Madan is a policy analyst here at the Center for Global Development, where she focuses on global health issues. Janine previously spent 2 years in Dakar, Senegal, where she worked with the UN World Food Programme supporting nutrition and food security programs across West Africa. So thank you so much again for being here with us today. I'm going to start off with a challenging question for you all on challenges. So in 10 to 15 years, what do you think will be the most urgent challenge in international development, or challenges? Right now, which of these receive too little attention, and what concrete steps can development professionals take to better address them? And we'll start here with Rebecca.
Okay. Well, I'm going to start with 2 answers. And the first is kind of a broader theme, and that is that everything you're going to hear us talk about today, and I'm entirely certain like everything that you in the audience work on as well, the crises that we face are crises that inherently transcend borders, right? I mean, you can't contain health or the environment or many of the other things that we're going to talk about to one country, right? But our primary actors in responding to them are still national governments. So I think that the main thing that we need is a coordinated global approach to producing global public goods from organizations like CGD, which does an excellent job on that. But the second answer is probably, I think, why I was asked to speak here today, and that would be the imminent increase in migration. If you look at demographic factors, labor shortages in many countries paired with labor surpluses in many, in sending countries. If you look at conflict trends, if you look at climate change trends, all of these, and when you look at the vast wage differentials that have been, again, written about mainly here at CGD, they all point to one thing, which is that in the coming decades and centuries, people are going to move more and more and more. And if you think about the refugee crisis, and I hesitate to use that word, in Europe right now, honestly, those levels are so low to what we can expect to come in coming decades. And the problem that we're seeing is that we don't, again, have that coordinated approach, right? So it seems like a difficult thing to say that what we need to focus on right now in this current political environment is migration, right? But what we've always found is that even in the most difficult of political economy circumstances, you can always find a technical solution and a technical approach to coordination that allows you to move the agenda forward. So my answer in terms of tangible things that we could do would be to look for tools that allow you to align labor market institutions across borders. A great one, my favorite example of that was written about here, global skills partnerships, which addresses the issue of skill accumulation in one country and movement to another by making it work for both employers and workers in both countries. So looking for technical things like that allow people to move and allow them to harness the benefits of movement while continuing to operate in this environment.
Thank you. We'll continue with you, Amin.
So I agree with everything, and I come from a health background, so I'm going to speak specifically about health. And I think a lot of what Rebecca said is applicable, in particular to global public goods. And we see that in the examples of Zika and Ebola and crises that emerge from communicable diseases. But as incomes rise, those health systems will certainly need to become more robust to be able to deal with those broad-scale communicable diseases, but also non-communicable diseases such as diabetes and heart issues and cancer. So as low-income economies start developing these sort of higher profiles of diabetes, they're going to need to come up with sort of the resources to finance that as well. The way that the high-income world looks at it is it's a chronic disease, and we should just continue to pay for it for forever until the person lives. And that's unfortunately not a sustainable approach for the low-income world. And so we need to think about that more critically, whether we address it from a behavioral angle or how we finance, or how we think about those issues. And no health system is perfect, and there's no silver bullet for how we should think about health systems. But really, we need to be thinking about 3 critical aspects of health systems, which includes having the right resources geared towards the right people. Are people getting the right resources when they need them? And also, are there sufficient skills to address what we need them to address? And can we operate in a financial situation that is sustainable?
So Obviously, I agree. I think that health system strengthening is crucial, especially looking 10, 15 years from now. But I actually see, in addition to that, a giant challenge in communications. I think that international development professionals are great at talking to each other, but not necessarily people on the outside. And I think this is problematic for two reasons. I think the most obvious is the current administration has very clearly signaled that it's still talking to its voter base, which turns to, you could call it non-traditional media outlets, kind of right-wing, more white right-wing outlets for its news, which means that the administration is also turning to those outlets to make policy decisions, which is not something that we've really seen before to this scale. So I think from a media standpoint, it's really important that if international development agencies and international development organizations want to build consensus that aid is a good thing, that we kind of need to move the needle on these international development priorities, it's time to change up the strategy and start meeting people where they are and maybe finding ways to work with some of these outlets and getting our message in there in a way that resonates. The other side of that, I just think that the second biggest challenge is harnessing this energy of this entire millennial generation that is very invested in having careers that make a difference in the world. I think, not to call you out 40-plus club, but you can moan and groan all you want about how much we use Snapchat, but this is a generation unlike any other that puts so much emphasis on trying to do meaningful work, making sure that they're leaving the world a better place, making sure that we are leaving the world a better place than we found it. And if you're looking at this through an international lens, I don't think there's any better industry to do that in than international development. So I would say, kind of a sort of a rebranding or rethinking of our messaging would be the most important way to move forward, and just, really taking a deep look inside and acknowledging that we can talk about these very complicated, intricate topics, but thinking about everyone outside of our industry and how to communicate that to them. Because, nothing kills dinner conversation at my family's house in the Midwest like, oh yeah, I work in international development. So I would say communications.
Great. I would definitely echo everything my fellow panelists have said. But what I want to talk about specifically, having had a background in humanitarian aid and working primarily on issues here at CGD related to forced displacement and conflict, is that an increasing challenge for development actors is going to be finding productive ways to engage in fragile and conflict-affected contexts. And traditionally, there's been sort of a siloed approach to this, where there are conflict management practitioners on one side, then kind of in the middle you have humanitarian actors who deal with immediate needs, but traditionally haven't looked at longer-term development sort of projects in their work streams. And then you have development actors who really have, in the past, tended to shy away from areas like conflict with a sort of political dimension to them. And it's clear, both in the current environment and moving forward, that that's an increasingly infeasible approach. By 2030, for example, the World Bank estimates that 46% of the global poor will be living in fragile and conflict-affected situations. So, even if development actors have a primary mandate to reduce poverty and inequality, it's very clear that that mandate is going to have to encompass engaging productively in conflict-affected states. And we see a lot of trends right now that point towards increasing conflict going forward, sad as it is to say. Issues like climate change, for example, are increasingly important drivers of conflict. If you look at, for example, the Horn of Africa, or even Syria, which actually stemmed from a dispute regarding water resources, climate change and environmental factors are a huge driver of conflict. Increasingly nationalistic policy agendas are also not very likely to have a positive impact vis-a-vis mitigating conflict. So this is clearly something that the global development community is going to have to learn to engage with productively. And coming to that, my recommendations for how to do that in a concrete way are, first of all, maybe engaging with actors who have greater experience and expertise working in these challenging situations. So developing stronger partnerships, for example, with humanitarian actors to sort of close the humanitarian development nexus. And also just having the temerity to maybe operate in contexts where development actors may have feared to go previously because of political or security considerations, finding ways to work around those areas. Innovation, I think, is another key way for actors to engage in this space. So constantly testing and evaluating new ways of operating that are tailored to the specific challenges of these contexts. And really an important part of that is not being afraid to fail. So if an approach doesn't work, learn from that and move on, trying something new. And addressing root causes. So this is something that's more of a specialty of the development community, tackling issues such as labor markets, or other critical development challenges, like, for example, strengthening governance around natural resource management. These are some positive ways that are more tailored to the technical expertise of the development community that can also mitigate conflict. So continuing to work on those issues, but perhaps with a greater lens on mitigating fragility and preventing conflict.
So switching gears a little bit, the big challenge for global development that I wanted to highlight today is antimicrobial resistance. So as many of you may or may not know, the misuse and overuse of antibiotic drugs, both in human medicine, but also in animal agriculture, is accelerating drug resistance. And the threat is only growing. And as Rebecca pointed out, this really is an example of a challenge that isn't limited to national boundaries. And estimates suggest that there might be as many as 10 million deaths a year by 2050 if AMR is left unchecked. And I think that this will have big implications for the globe, but I think these implications will be particularly pronounced in low and middle income countries, where diarrheal diseases, respiratory diseases still are among the leading causes of death. And I think that given this is such a multidimensional problem, I think global development professionals are going to have to focus on a wide range of responses to the problem. I think the link to the health sector is sometimes pretty evident to a lot of us, but I think this is a challenge that really straddles agriculture as well as environmental issues. So, while we need to focus on more investments in finding new drugs and finding new antibiotics in particular, I think we also need to think about how we can develop more robust data and surveillance systems in countries, both in human medicine, but also in the animal and livestock sectors. And I also think it's an issue that really has synergies with a lot of other efforts that link to a lot of the other SDGs. So for example, improving sanitation and improving access to clean water around the world is going to help reduce the spread of infectious diseases, which will in turn reduce the demand on antibiotics. And I think there is a growing understanding and recognition that controlling the spread of AMR really is a global public good, and this wouldn't be a CGD event if we didn't talk about global public goods. And there's increased evidence about how the cost of investing in addressing AMR is actually something that has a very, very high economic rate of return. So I'll end by saying that I will acknowledge that this issue is receiving a lot of attention on the global scale. The WHO has released a global action plan. The UN General Assembly is convening high-level meetings about AMR. But I still think there's a lot more left to be done, and it'll need to be, solutions will need to be thought of in truly a global way, much like Rebecca mentioned in her opening statements.
Great, thank you. So budget cuts are looming. We're all very aware of it. And I'm wondering, Ami and Rebecca, thinking you two maybe are feeling this very saliently right now. So let's start with Ami, if you could comment a little bit on this. So how should development professionals adapt to potential budget cuts? Let's assume they're gonna happen. Should they act to bolster the consensus behind international development? Should we say, the ship has sailed, let's focus on the private sector? What do you think?
So I do think that the private sector is going to play an increasingly important role in development, for sure. However, I would say know the relative advantage of your institution. The public sector and NGOs have a lot to offer that can't be accomplished by the private sector, and leverage that advantage and see how you can make formidable partnerships that leverage that advantage.
Awesome. Rebecca, what do you think?
echoing really what Ami said, I think that we're going to see a shift to just new actors in the space. I mean, you're seeing budget cuts from the global north, right? But I mean, we've been saying in the development world for years in institutions like my own, right, that we need to empower leaders in the global south to really harness the development agenda. And that hasn't happened, right? And why hasn't that happened? Because influence follows money. So I mean, I want to say that there's perhaps a silver lining here. Perhaps we kind of restructure who leads in development and we embrace that. We kind of lean into the change.
Awesome, thank you.
Ideally.
Any thoughts down here that you want to throw out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this point about knowing the relative advantage of your institution and how great the work you were doing is totally critical. And I think the communication side of that would be finding the way to talk about it. You know, like the work that, of course, MCC does, there are just so many things that you can pick out that will relate to people who aren't in the international development space, and just finding a way to boil it down so that, you know, it's meaningful. Like, you know, people will hear, oh my God, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, it might go down in flames. And, you know, most people in this country are gonna be like, I don't even know what you're talking about. But if you say, this agency that makes a bunch of money for the government is gonna go away and then we're gonna have less money, like that might be like a more meaningful way to communicate that. So I think, you know, certainly like finding the value and then also finding the best way to make your case.
Yeah, I think just to echo a little bit both what Rebecca and Ami have touched on about new actors becoming increasingly relevant, and also what Kate spoke to about finding different ways to communicate with your audience. I think that yes, we're certainly seeing quite a paradigm shift from traditional donors and actors in the development space, particularly in the global north, but all is not necessarily lost. And I think that a key priority should be being strategic when engaging with these types of actors. So if a government is shifting towards aid policies that perhaps are more geared towards serving the national interest, point out how specific projects actually do serve the national interest. For example, in the conflict space, you know, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So if you can address the causes of a conflict before a conflict breaks out, you can prevent, you know, the attendant refugee crisis, economic disruptions, loss of life, et cetera, at a lower cost. And another part of that is making sure that all projects are implemented with an eye towards an evidence base, so that you're really showing how projects are cost effective, underpinned by rigorous evidence, and how they work. So kind of bringing a more business-like approach to a field where maybe traditionally the messaging has been more about feelings and an appeal to emotion.
Yeah, and then jumping off of Krishnan's point, I was also going to add that I think our ability to use evidence and different kinds of evidence that we can get from evaluations will be in the limelight as we try and build this consensus around the need for investing in development. I think, you know, impact is important, but I think, as Krishnan pointed out, really looking at cost and how we can get the most bang for our buck is going to be really in the limelight the next few years.
So thank you all. That's actually all the time we have for our panel. We're going to move on to our interactive portion now, but please join me in giving a big round of applause to our phenomenal panelists. You guys can go take your seats.
Yes, panelists, thank you so much for sharing your insight. That was great. So now that you've had a chance to hear from some of your peers, their opinions about the future of development, CGD again wants to know what you think. And so this next segment is going to be a little unusual for a CGD event in that we'll be moving around. But I'd really like to get kind of a visual sense, a visual distribution on your opinions for these key questions about the future of development. So what I'm going to do is to turn this entire conference room into an opinion scale. One side is going to represent the agreement. The other side is going to represent disagreement. I'm going to read out a statement about the future of international development, and I'm going to ask you each to stand up and move to either side according to how much you agree with the statement. Now, importantly, this isn't a dichotomy. It's not binary. None of these are black and white statements. So if maybe you agree with most of the prompt, but not all of it, maybe you can stand halfway toward agree, but not all the way. Likewise, if you think there's a grain of truth, but overall it's just misguided, you can stand halfway toward the disagree side. Truly ambivalent people, the middle's there for you.
So you all know that we here at CGD love our numbers, we love our graphs. So this gets even cooler, I think. We're going to be experimenting with some data visualization based on this vote with your feet polling. So after this, as Charlie said, we're going to have a publication that will come out, and we're going to try and graph the visual distribution. And based on you all have surveys here, so we're also going to be trying to graph and experiment with some data visualization based on your numeric responses, and then there's some more explanation on there about your comments. So I hope you're ready. Charlie's going to read out the statement now. Remember, this way is agree, this way is disagree.
It's fluid, it's not discrete scale. Okay, so the first statement is, you guys have already read it, international development is working. Go ahead and stand up and move to where you align.
Agree, disagree.
Disagree. Your right is agree, your left is disagree.
I'm over it.
All right.
No, please.
So no one knows is what the consensus is. Now, if I could ask Sarah Ann and Jared to come grab mics. I'm going to ask a volunteer from the agree side. Why do you think international development is working so well? Raise your hand if you could say your name and affiliation and why you're standing where you're standing. So a volunteer on the agree side. So bring him like this man in the blue shirt.
Thanks. So Chris, my name is Chris. I represent the European Space Agency at the World Bank. I would even stand here because I think we really need some more optimism these days, right? So if just me standing here can move some of your minds towards this side, I already did a good job.
Thank you.
Thank
now
you.
Someone from the disagree side, if someone's willing to tell us a couple words about why you're over there, we'll have a mic brought to you. Great.
My name is Rashmi. I came from Nepal to study international development in American University. I'm graduating soon. And I think it's not working, and we have to be mindful of it because I literally saw the devastation international development industry is doing in our country. A lot of duplication of resources, a lot of adding value to the existing corruption that's happening in the country. So on the ground, it's really not working. We have to be mindful and we have to be thoughtful about it.
Thank you.
Thank you. And then maybe someone from the middle who maybe might have an interesting perspective, maybe think the question is leading on a little bit. Someone from the middle. In the green shirt.
Mary Kate Costello with the Hunger Project. So while I do think there are a lot of international development initiatives that work, I think one thing that we are struggling with now is making sure that programs have clear exit strategies and are actually sustainable. We too often are still following the old models of international development that are very much go in, provide a service or a resource allocation, and then get out. And then it's making people more dependent, adding to corruption, as our colleague has just said. And then secondly to that is the funding streams don't necessarily align with what the needs are. Too often development can be very imperial from the folks actually implementing the development, and instead of being more community-led with community solutions.
Thank you.
Interesting. Thank you.
I'm going to redo the second statement now. Thank you. In 20 years, the United States will remain the single largest contributor of foreign assistance. Agree, disagree. We'll be asking you for opinions again over the mic, so prepare them if you're ready.
Oh, man. Well, to stay maybe we'll start with, there's a few people on this side, so no one has to volunteer, but who on this side is willing to talk about why they think the U.S. is going to go strong, stay the strongest donor? Any perspectives from this side?
Hi, I'm Sarah Abrahimi with USAID. I just don't know who else is going to really step up to the plate. I mean, from a geopolitical sense, we don't know what the world is going to look like in 20 years. But if I was to try to project my idea of maybe who else would step up, I don't really think. I mean, the European Union is going through such, quote unquote, identity crisis right now, and I'm really hoping that that China doesn't just continue to take over and throw money into development because their motives are questionable at best. So maybe I'm also being an eternal optimist and hoping that U.S. does stay in that position.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Someone from the larger disagree side, sure.
So I work at CSIS and I'm Nigerian, and while I disagree that the US will be the largest contributor because I think other countries will step to the plate, I disagree with what you said. I'm so sorry, because I don't think the US's motives are completely innocent as well. So I would be on that side because I truly believe that the US will keep throwing money into development because some people truly believe in it and some people believe in the political reasons, but I don't think they will be because other countries will step up to the plate as well.
Yeah, one more perspective, please.
Hi, a big from the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. I think you also have to define foreign assistance because I think that's like critical. That's why I feel I'm more in the middle. I sort of like agree with both people because I think at the same time U.S. aid and the U.S. government will continue funding the most because they have geopolitical reasons. They believe in democracy, human rights, and governance. Maybe setting the Trump administration aside, but on the other side, in terms of investment from China, there's more than just giving things for like PEPFAR or malaria initiatives. It's also investment in infrastructure and those sort of things as well. And so like the trade versus aid debate, I guess, is like a long old hat, but I think expanding foreign assistance will change. Also things like remittances are very important for development as well. So I think it's a very narrow question to just say foreign assistance. I think it's much broader than that.
Awesome.
And agreed, lots of things.
Nice. And our final prompt, final statement is, going forward, donor countries should dedicate fewer resources to stable countries and more to fragile and post-conflict states. Again, agree, disagree. Go ahead.
Awesome. This was a tough one. So can someone who strongly agrees offer a comment why? No pressure. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, my name is Alyssa Jackson, and I work with the U.S. Institute of Peace. So we're very much involved in like all the conflict stuff. And I think when you look at the money that we give to stable states versus the money you give to fragile and post-conflict states, it's crazy. We don't give very much at all. So I think it'd be great if we gave more. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you. And who thinks that it doesn't matter, we should still keep aid going to the stable countries because there's still a lot of need there? Anyone on this side like to speak to that? Thanks, man.
Thanks. I don't necessarily think that the opposite is true, but I don't think that's the main criteria in how we select, how we allocate aid across countries. I work for MCC as well, and we mostly fund stable countries, and I think there's a valid argument for that. And obviously, the statistic with about how much more of development assistance is going to be needed in fragile and conflict-affected countries is a good argument as well, and that might call for a lot of resources. So I'm not sure I think it's a good criteria.
Anyone from the middle want to volunteer why you're torn on this?
There we go. One.
My name is Erin Prappis, and I work at the Pan American Health Organization. So coming from a health perspective, I guess I'm just thinking about stable countries like India. So if we don't continue to fund countries like India that have extremely large populations, from a health perspective, we are going to see some issues with antimicrobial resistance and all of the kinds of things that we were talking about earlier in terms of disease control, both communicable and non-communicable diseases. So that's why I feel kind of torn about it. I think it's important that we maybe focus the attention of our funding towards the things that the stable countries still need help with, but not necessarily totally ignore countries that are post-conflict.
Thank you. I just want to say, if you have more comments for us, if you thought this was not good criteria, tell us about it. Please write these on the surveys you got at registration, hand them out. CGD, like we said, will be having this publication, and we would love to include some quotations from you. So give us your name, your affiliation. We'd love to include that. And also tweet at us if that's a better medium for you. And please fill out the numeric responses as well.
All right, so thank you guys for your active participation. Feel free to take the nearest seat as I explain the next activity, although we'll be moving again soon, so it's up to you. In a minute, for this last segment, I'm going to ask you to divide up into 6 groups representing 6 topics. These topics: global health, migration, education, climate change, gender, and the private sector and development. I'd like to get a sense of, in this particular sector or field, what you all think the main challenges will be in 10, 15, even 20 years. So once you divide in these groups, you have 20 minutes to answer the following prompt and come to a consensus as a group. Again, this field sector, what signal challenge would be most pressing in 10, 15 years, why, and then what 2 or 3 key steps should we take to better address these challenges. And so each one of these kind of seat islands that we've set up in the conference center is going to host a group, and researchers and program coordinators from CGD have graciously volunteered to facilitate these breakout sessions. So when I call out a topic, facilitators, if you could hold your sign up and walk to your section, that would be great. So global health. Raise your sign. Thanks, Rebecca. And you are up here. Migration. You do have a sign, it's right there. She's right there. Education. There's Dev. Where are you going to be? Dev's going to be right back there. Climate change. There's Emily in the back there. Gender. Thanks, Tommy. Tommy's up front and center. And then private sector and development is Jared back center. So hopefully now you know where your topics are. I'm going to ask you to move soon, but before I do, I anticipate some of these topics will be more popular than others, so please try to spread out as evenly as possible. If your first choice has excess demand, go somewhere maybe you're less familiar with, but you just like to learn more about. Secondly, each facilitator has a notepad, so please elect a volunteer to take good notes. Again, this is all going into the report that we're putting out on this event. So we really want your input there. So go ahead and move. I'll give you a minute. And again, it's 20 minutes for this prompt, coming to a consensus. And then finally, as you're getting settled, at the end of the 20 minutes, I'm going to ask each group to elect a presenter to give a summary of the consensus that your group arrived at. So after 20 minutes, we're looking forward to hear from each group about the answer to the prompt. All right, I've given you 20 minutes again, so go ahead and start. Good, right? Just noticed that we have 5 minutes left. 5 minutes, keep talking. Here's some really interesting things. So we're at 2 minutes left. If you haven't already, consider trying to come to an answer to the prompt. 2 minutes left. All right, time is up. I'll give you a few seconds to finish up any final comments. Couple seconds. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I was walking around, and I heard some really, really interesting dialogue going on, so thank you for being so active and participating. So as I said, we're going to go around to each group. Please elect one or two presenters to present your answers to this prompt. We're going to go ahead and start with climate change back there, Emily's group. Yeah, mics are coming to you.
All right. Hello, it's me again. So I think it's really good that we start with climate change as the first topic, because I think our concluding note at the very end of our discussion is that climate change is interrelated with all of the different discussions, which are now no longer up there. But first of all, they obviously relate to the refugee problem. I think there's two ways that we can talk about the refugee problem. One is related to drought conditions and how food security will increasingly become a problem in especially sub-Saharan Africa and the developing world. They'll no longer have access to food. They'll no longer be able to produce food, and that creates global refugee flows. Another is in the Pacific Islands. As people become displaced and their islands go underwater, they'll have to move. So that relates to the global refugee crisis. It relates to global health, especially because diseases are especially prominent in these areas and refugee camps. And I'm going to kind of ignore the rest. But private sector was the one I wanted to touch on as well, because the solutions, and we're trying to think of how can we better address it. It's such a big problem. We mentioned that there is a political consensus problem. We don't think the debate is resolved. It's not over yet, especially from this administration. And sort of the conversation needs to be pushed towards it's a big problem and we need to be able to resolve it these days. But the solutions to climate change, they have to come from many different actors. We said that it's not just the United States government that's important, it's local actors and local systems that are really important to be helped to resolve the climate change problem, but also for the private sector, and the private sector gets involved. They're the ones who have to get their global supply chains and have sustainability. I was telling the group, I listened to a talk by the head of Mars's Global Sustainability Project, and the carbon footprint of Mars Inc., just like the food company, is as big as several like small countries. And so if these companies do not work on their carbon footprint, we'll not be able to solve the global climate problem. So those are sort of the things we talked about. And then the impacts, one thing that we talked about was the national security implications. And then we talk about it a lot, but someone mentioned on the panel beforehand that the Syrian refugee crisis and also the Syrian conflict originally was caused by things like droughts occurring in the countryside, people being concentrated in urban areas. And the DoD and our military constantly think about this. The DoD is putting out white papers about what are resource wars, what are those sort of things that could happen as a result of climate change. So climate change is sort of like a systemic exacerbator of all other things. And I think it's something that we have to pay attention to. And unfortunately, I think our group was a little pessimistic about how much we would be able to do to resolve it. And one thing we talked about was resilience. I sort of think resilience is the buzzword that gets thrown out a lot these days, but you need to have resilient communities so they can respond to shocks. They can respond to a food security shock. You can respond to a climate change shock. You can respond to a drought. You can respond to like a health pandemic. Resilience is a really big thing, and so there's a lot of problems, and I don't really think I could summarize all of it, but that was most of it.
Great, thank you. And can you repeat your name and affiliation?
I'm Abik from the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. It's very long, USGLC for short.
Thank you, Beck. And so private sector, enthusiastic to hear from you. Reminder to keep I know these are complex issues, but keep your remarks concise because our elevators are closing.
Hi, we didn't stick to the prompt very well, but we had a good conversation. Some of the things we talked about for the upcoming 10 to 15 years are the importance of addressing corruption when it comes to the private sector and how private sector actors are either complicit in it or can exacerbate it, and the importance of host governments being able to produce good regulations and policies that not only encourage the private sector but also limit it in the right ways and make sure that it's an equitable and sustainable system. Some of the other things we talked about were being able to better speak to the private sector and really express how the private sector is critical to bridging the financing gap and to reaching development goals that we want to reach. And especially in this time of budget cuts, how important it is to have those non-traditional partnerships and to really foster those advantages that the private sector has that the U.S. government doesn't have. And we also really highlighted the role of the U.S. government and other governments in enabling private companies to go into emerging markets where they otherwise wouldn't go. And the last thing was just our generation and becoming, in the next 10, 15 years, being able to operate at that bridge of between public and private and really enhance that cooperation.
Awesome, thank you. Can we move on to education?
We are a tiny group of people here. So there are more children in school these days, but they are not learning. That's the biggest issue for next 10 to 15 years. Why? I think there is less investment in teacher training, and quality of education is such a black box, it's a very complex issue. So donors just probably not thinking about it too much. So 2-3 steps that we can take, probably more money does not help. So we'll have to rethink about the funding structure, how to prioritize, areas. Maybe we can invest more in teacher education, training them rigorously for a long, long period of time, rather than, building schools. They're important, but I studied with no school building for 1 year, so I'm still here in the United States. So, probably like knowledge sharing, good cases from developed countries. Maybe private sector can start replicating those in some of the poor countries. So those are the steps that we thought of. Thank you.
Thank you. Global health.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Carrie Dobies. I'm with JSI, John Snow Incorporated. As public health professionals, we had a lot of different ideas, and so we kind of blended them all together. So some of the topics that we said were very particularly important to us in the next 10 to 15 years are surveillance of diseases, infectious disease outbreaks, nutrition, strengthening supply chains and health systems so that we can get medicines and medical supplies out to the most rural areas. So what we did was we kind of encompassed all of those under the general topic of health system strengthening. And what we said, one of the primary first steps we could take is increasing health education, particularly at the community level. So working with community leaders, local chiefs, community health workers to be kind of a bridge from the kind of government level to the community level, and pass along any messages that are needed, whether it's for a disease outbreak or whether it's for just general improvement in health practices, hand washing, that sort of thing. And we had a couple of other steps. So another one I'm going to pass to my colleague Stephanie to talk about a more customized approach.
Hi, I'm Stephanie with Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. And one way to incentivize people to go out and educate is you can use well-designed performance-based financing mechanisms. Another approach to health system strengthening is cloud-based and electronic registries to link systems to one another.
So one of the other approaches that we mentioned that we discussed in our group was using technology and new systems. So we had a little bit of a debate about whether some of these very rural communities would be ready for these systems, but we do think that even in the communities that aren't ready, it's important to start to develop them in tandem with these other approaches. And we also talked a little bit about the importance of educating local health professionals throughout this process. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Gender?
Thank you. I'm Sarah. I'm a student at GW and an intern with the Global Women's Leadership Initiative at the Wilson Center. So the major kind of goal and thing we see having to change in the next 10 to 15 years is that gender should no longer be its own issue area within development, and that it really needs to be mainstreamed with all of these issues that we're talking about that are so important, and just continuing to ingrain gender. 3 key steps that we thought were getting more data and gender disaggregated data on gender, because that's how you get the funding and that's how you get more backing for these issues. The preservation of human rights and dignity through grassroots work we thought is really important to kind of put more contextual approach to all of this. And lastly, really including a diversity of opinion in implementation and programming, including men in this discussion, including people from different backgrounds and ethnicities and things like that, to make sure that we have really a full and just really well thought out approach.
Thank you. And lastly, migration.
So we were a small group also, Solidarity to Education, and so we had very sort of focused discussions, I think mainly centered around perceptions of migration and building institutions to help manage it, and then the sort of success or not thereof of those institutions. So we sort of dove into that and went considerably beyond the 15-year timeline, but and so focused on looking at how advocacy and dissemination of results, but also more emotive materials, can help achieve these goals, and then looking into the longer term, looking at institutions and how to change that and set those up.
Thank you. So that is it. We want to release you as quickly as possible to the food that is waiting for you all back there and get you safely home. I want to thank you again for your participation, your deep thoughts. I really enjoyed my discussion with the climate change team back here. I learned a lot that I hadn't really been thinking about lately. I continue to be every day impressed by the level of thinking and dialogue that's going on among our age group, and I really look forward to continuing this conversation at CGD. So if you were a note taker, oh yes, of course.
Considering you guys are like the leading, international development people on research and on, what's new and innovative, what can we do in our respective roles in our respective classrooms to empower you all as sort of the leaders on this? So seriously, what are some tangible things that aren't theoretical that we can do?
Well, first of all, continue to come when we host events like this. And if you see anyone else hosting a similar event, I think we often underestimate how valuable our voices are. As Amanda Glassman said, the 40 pluses who are truly the leaders, and to really not think that your voice doesn't matter as much. I mean, you're not usually going to have a seat at the panel. This is pretty unusual, but it really does matter, and people are listening. And I'm killing time a little bit as I'm trying to think how to answer your question, because it is really hard, right, when you aren't the person who always has the seat on the panel, to think how you can contribute. I would say as well, to not be nervous at CGD specifically, to reach out to our fellows here, to the junior staff here. If you have an idea that you think that we're missing, I mean, don't just tweet at us. Honestly, send us an email and tell us what you think we're missing on. If there's a data set out there you think we should be using, please let us know. I think we always assume, again, our voices aren't valuable, but I can think of a lot of senior fellows here who would be very happy to receive a well thought out, well-written email from someone in our age group. Do you have anything you want to add while I keep
I do.
thinking?
I would echo everything you said. So thank you, Emily. Couple of things. Learn as much as you can, especially if you're a student right now. Second, again, be as involved as you can. CGD has events almost every week, as well as tons of other forums around DC. For example, I know the grad schools will host a lot of lectures, so be as involved as possible. Secondly, don't underestimate yourself. A year ago, I was an intern here, and I got to take a lot more initiative than I thought I would be able to. So look for those ways that you can make a difference in your companies, in your schools, and then don't be afraid to actually do it.
I want to pick up on the being in your companies and your schools. My dad always talks about being like the inside agent. So he'd worked with Walmart, for example, for many years on sustainable supply chain issues. He said that that's something that he feels our generation overlooks too much, is the value of being that inside agent. So when we say, you know, I would never go work at Mars, for example, those guys, you know, I don't agree with the stuff that they're doing, but actually, you know, spending 5-10 years working there isn't such a bad thing. So that's, you know, long in the future as we all have current jobs and careers we're going towards, but that's one thing that I wanted to add on top of that. And finally, being involved at a domestic level as well. So Kate did a phenomenal job leading us through strategic communications, and I think that's something we all have a responsibility for every day. So when you bring that up at your Midwestern dinner table, you know, when everyone's faces go blank, take the 10 extra seconds to explain why global development matters, how we can talk about better, you know, be that advocate that we all say that we want to see, even though it's honestly very painful sometimes at the dinner table or at happy hours.
Well, thank you for this last minute impromptu question. So before we release you to the foods, so you can network and have fun and enjoy dinner, couple requests. First, those survey sheets that we handed out at the beginning that we used for a second segment, please hand those to your facilitators so they can give them back to us. Secondly, if you spoke, either you presented for your group or you spoke during the moving around, please come up to, either tell your facilitator, come up to Emily or me to give us your name and affiliation so we can feature you in this report we're putting out after this.
And look for tweets directed at you and look for the publication we'll have on this. So thank you so much and go enjoy the food. Woo!
Thank you, everyone. Feel free to eat.
We actually need to release everyone for the elevators, but
go ahead and eat, everyone. Thanks.
You can find a